Hey guys, it's just me on this video because I am going to be sharing my testimony with you. I know that I touch on my past here and there in our videos and make references to when I was in the New Age movement and all of that, and I thought that might come across as confusing for some who may not know my whole story. So I just wanted to sit down and run through how I came out of the New Age, how I came to Christ, and a little bit of how I came into Torah obedience. So I guess starts like all stories would in childhood. My dad, he was raised Christian, and my mom, she was raised semi-Catholic. Her and her siblings always joked about being recovering Catholics. So she had a lot of her own ideas about Jesus, and none of which really involved much of the Bible. And my dad was the type that basically he would tell us, we're supposed to believe because he tells us to believe. So that was kind of the dynamic of parents that I had influencing me as a child. And we would be in and out of church. My dad would want to take us, and my mom wouldn't. And there was a constant struggle going on there. And us kids were definitely in the middle of that. And so as a young child, I can remember, like trying to say prayers at night in my bed. And I'd never really felt anything. I don't know if I was supposed to feel anything, but I never really felt any kind of a connection to God. So as I started to get into my tweens, like 10 and 11 years old, I had started going to the library by myself. Back in second or third grade, we lived right down the street from the local library. So I started getting curious about spirituality and specifically witchcraft, Wicca, and I started looking at books in my library about that topic. So at the age of 12, I came home with a book called Dancing Shadows. This is what got me started on my journey. I know now, years and years later, I looked up that book and found out all the information in it was totally basically made up by the author. But at that time, as a child, I didn't know any better, and this book basically was teaching the kind of zeitgeist philosophy that Christianity basically was just a plagiarism of all pagan religions. And so basically, reading that book for me, I think at that young age, really solidified my choice to go down the path that I went down, which was Wicca and eventually, more Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, those kinds of things. So when I was 14, my grandmother, I talked my grandmother into buying me an actual book about witchcraft called Teen Witch by a really popular Wiccan artist. And my parents found this book and freaked out and tried to take it away from me. And I ended up getting the book back. And basically from that time on, I considered myself a Wiccan throughout most of my teen years. And I was dabbling in all of the, activities in these various books I was reading about casting spells and love spells and all that kind of stuff. Things that a young, vulnerable, girl who's, in her awkward phase, would find appealing. In my teen years, I also started struggling with severe depression and anxiety. And I ended up starting to cut myself. I was very much a tortured soul, and self-injury was something that came along. It was introduced to me by a friend, and then I took it, and it became a very big part of my life for a very long time. And I know now that most likely that was a form of spiritual oppression. So I really was very much always seeking whatever feeling I thought I should have when I prayed to God as a young child. I was seeking that. What I say now that I know better, is I had a God-shaped hole in my heart, and I was trying to fill that hole with everything that I thought was spiritual and good and holy. And I was just getting all my information on what was spiritual and good and holy from really unholy sources. And I just didn't know any better. I was very much in that spiritual blindness that I think a lot of people are. So throughout my teen years, I, continued to progress down studying all kinds of world religions. I always joked about how I liked to have a buffet of religions. I liked to take everything that I liked from every religion and apply it to myself and leave out anything that I didn't like. And I, by my 16, 17, 18, I was very much delving into Buddhist and Hindu texts. And even at a point of time in my early 20s, I spent about 5 years studying the Quran. Basically, I wanted to know everything about every religious book that I could, with the exception of the Bible. I always had an aversion to the Bible. I always had an inner hostility toward it. Some of that, I think, comes from unfortunately, the way my father tried to teach me about the Bible. It was never really him teaching me about it. It was just more him putting it to me and saying, you have to believe in this. And I would see like all of the, inconsistencies with, my father being against homosexuality, but also loving to eat shrimp and pork. And, there were things in there that I could see people weren't living out. And I judged the book based on the people who claimed to follow the book, not realizing that that's backwards. That's not the way you're supposed to do it. So I spent many years studying all different kinds of religions. I spent time at a Buddhist temple here in Colorado. I volunteered up there and painted a bunch of the artistic tiles that went inside of it. I put my hands in the soft clay of their giant Buddha statue that's now painted in gold inside of the temple. And so I was just very much sold into the coexist idea and that just the new age spirituality. I used to really hate that term New Age because in my opinion it was insulting, because all of the things I was practicing and believing, there was nothing new about it. It's all the old ancient religions. But nowadays, now that I've studied where the New Age movement actually started from here in the last, just around 100 or so years, I understand that having a conglomeration of things, of religions like that, actually was rather new. That's something that started mainly with the Theosophical Society, with Helena Blavatsky in the late 1800s. She was the first to really start putting all of these religions together and promoting them as, one melting pot of religion for people. So I hit my 20s, the depression and anxiety that I had been living with for a long time just kind of got worse. I really struggled with addiction. I come from a very long line of alcoholics on my mom's side, and so alcohol was something that I definitely used to numb my pain and deal with social anxiety and things like that. I started having grand mal seizures at the age of 18 and found out that I was actually epileptic and had been born with it, but I hadn't had any actual grand mal seizures until that point in my life. So that was a real struggle for me for a majority of my 20s. I was having lots of seizures, and then I was drinking on top of all of that, which I'm sure just made all of that worse. I just had no direction in my life. My mother and father divorced when I was in high school, and so they were... my father kind of was out of the picture, and I had a very codependent relationship with my mother. So my parents had divorced when I was in high school, and I became very codependent with my mom. Living with her, my dad was pretty much out of the picture. He kind of remarried and went on and had a whole new family going, and me and my siblings were like trying to pick up the pieces from that whole, our family falling apart. And my addiction just progressed, as well as my delving into my New Age practices. So about the age of 24, I had a period of time where I had a total mental breakdown, and I checked myself into a mental hospital for a few days. And when I was in that hospital, I met another guy who he also struggled with addiction, and he had been a member of NA. So the day I got out of that mental institution, I went to my first NA meeting. And so sobriety became something that, something I realized I needed to do. I realized I had that step one moment of admitting I had a problem, and then I was powerless over my addiction, and then I needed help to recover. So I would say that my journey to really seeking God probably began with entering the 12-step program, because even though they don't call him God or Yahweh or anything, they do encourage you to seek a higher power, and it is a spiritual program. So once I started going to NA, I really started delving into prayer, and I think that's what probably started me on the journey to eventually coming to Christ. It was still a few years later, but I became much more open to actually praying to a higher power. Before, I was doing spells and mantras and meditations and self-hypnosis type things, and not really trying to connect with any power above me. So that was probably the biggest thing that changed about my spiritual life when I got into NA, is that I started actually trying to really pray and talk to my higher power, as I called it at the time, or divine source was another phrase that I was comfortable using. I did not want to call it God. And you'll find that with a lot of New Agers. A lot of New Agers they're seeking God, and they just don't know it. They want to call him everything but his actual title or his actual name. And they certainly don't want to consider the fact that he could be the God of the Bible. So that was very much the mindset I was in. And NA started to improve my life following that program, having accountability, trying to have a more healthy spiritual and prayer life. And then about 3 years into being in NA, I met, I used to say I met a monster in the rooms, but Christ has softened my heart quite a bit about this. I might get a little emotional. I met another very broken soul in those rooms. His name was Casey. Excuse me, guys. And he was a pretty much lifelong career criminal. Of course I knew this just looking at him. He was covered in prison tattoos. And the first thought I had when I saw him sitting in the room across from me was, don't talk to the guy with the neck tattoo. Like, I just immediately was like, oh, don't talk to that guy. But things didn't quite work out that way. He was very much a sociopath, and so he came across as extremely charming. Everybody was under his spell, and he could sell himself to anybody, under any circumstance, and make you think whoever you wanted him to be, that's exactly who he was. Just classic sociopath. So I started dating him, and as I was dating Casey, there was a medical emergency in my sister's household with her husband, and he all of a sudden couldn't work, but he blew up his hand with a firework on New Year's Eve. And so he couldn't work, so my sister had to go to work full time, and she has 3 kids, and she asked me to come move in with her to help with her kids while she went to work. And so I decided to go ahead and do that. I quit my job, and Casey had made it seem like he would work and help pay rent there and all that stuff. And again, it didn't quite go the way I planned because, as it turns out, Casey was the type of criminal who's habitual. He would be out on parole for a few months and behave himself, but then he would go back into his felonious activity, selling drugs, running guns, armed robberies, violent violent crimes, and he would abscond from parole, go back into his life of violent crime, and then be caught and then serve a few years in prison. So this was his history for about 15 years before I met him. And of course, I didn't realize all of that until I had already taken the plunge into that very dark relationship. But I really, I didn't have any direction in my life. I didn't have the Spirit of God in me. I know now that there was a still small voice inside of me the whole time telling me something's not right, but I just ignored it because I felt like I had the things in life that I wanted, and that very much wasn't the case. So while I was living with my sister, Casey had come to live with us, and then he did his normal pattern. He ended up disappearing, and I fell into a crazy deep depression for like a week. He showed back up on Valentine's Day and said he wanted to take me down to Denver with him. I live in Fort Collins. This is about an hour north of Denver. And I didn't know he goes to Denver because that's where a lot of drugs and guns are being moved down there. I mean, there's just a lot of crime down in a big city like that. And I was very naive. I mean, I had partied a lot in my life, and gone to bars and stuff, but I had never been like the street drug person. I had never fallen into that kind of lifestyle. So I had never really been around serious crime or anything like that. And I had never really been with an emotionally and mentally abusive and manipulative sociopath. So all of the doubts that I had in myself about leaving and going down there with him, again, that was a still small voice inside of me that I just totally ignored, because I mean, I hadn't experienced anyone in that lifestyle before. So I was giving him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, it turns out everything he ever told me basically was a lie, but that's just par for the course with someone who's pathological like that. So I left my sister's house, and I was only supposed to be gone for the weekend. And once I got down to Denver, I realized everything that this person was up to. He was just committing a lot of felonies, and I didn't know what to do. I was really afraid of him. He had loaded guns. He had told me he had killed people. And I just was basically terrified. My sister would call to check on me, and I couldn't actually tell her what was really happening down there. I didn't want to scare her. So while I was down there stuck with him, he wouldn't bring me home, basically is how it turned out. I guess I was held captive down there. I asked for him to take me home, and he just refused. So while I was down there, stuck down there, meanwhile, my sister is back at home, and she doesn't know what's going on, so she thinks I've just bailed on her and her kids after I came to help, which I totally understand her thinking that. So while I was down in Denver with Casey, he sexually assaulted me 3 times when I was down there, which made me even more, I guess I had some Stockholm syndrome going on. I guess I was like identifying with my abuser, and just very much, I didn't know what to do. I had no way to get away from him. I was scared he would kill me. And one night, I was down there for about 8 days. And one night, a friend who lives in Denver texted me at like 10:30 at night. And I was in the car with Casey, and we were fighting. And he was starting to get crazy. And at this point, I knew now, I had seen him get into the crazy mode now, where he was outright psychopathic and terrifying me and threatening my life, and talking about wanting to hit me, and just stuff I had never experienced before. And right at that moment in time, a good friend of mine texted me and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And I said, "No, I'm not okay. I need a ride back to Fort Collins." So my friend drove all the way from a whole different city down there, a different suburb of Denver, and picked me up, and I left, and he took me all the way back home. And that night I got home, and Casey called me, and it's the cycle of abuse where someone will abuse you and then you'll get away from them and then they will sweet talk you and apologize and cry. I mean, this guy was really convincing as far as me thinking he was remorseful. So basically, I went through this horrific traumatic experience down there with him, and I got away from him, and then he got me on the phone and got his claws back in me for a little while again. So, but he still stayed absconded from parole. Like, he never came back to live the dream life that he kept promising me. He stayed down there dealing the drugs and the guns and all the really messed up stuff, and just basically making me false promises every time we talked about how he would come up and get me and blah, blah, blah. So I started having a nervous breakdown again. I know now that I was traumatized. I was, totally in shock from what had happened. I hadn't accepted yet inside myself exactly what he had done to me, and that, I probably needed to go get some help. So this started to affect my relationship with my sister and her husband, and eventually we got into an argument and she kicked me out. And from there, I basically was homeless. I stayed with a friend for a while. I tried to continue that relationship with Casey for a little while until after 2 months, it became very clear to me that he was never going to keep any of his promises and I needed to move on. And I also had come to terms with the fact that he had sexually assaulted me and realized that I needed to press charges. And at that point, he was threatening to kill me if I did press charges. So I basically was waiting for him to be caught and arrested so that I could feel safe to go press the charges. And I tell this hard part of the story. It might seem really random, but it really was the catalyst that led to me being so broken inside that I eventually was desperate enough to call on Jesus. But that's a little while down the road. I'll get there soon. So I let go of Casey. I basically was estranged from my sister and her family. I ended up in a shelter here called Crossroads Safe House. It's a shelter for survivors of domestic violence. And this is really where I can see God really starting to work in my life. Because I ended up in this shelter. I lost everything. I had basically, the few possessions I could keep in storage somewhere. And I still had a good relationship with my mom and my stepdad, but they would go traveling in their RV for the winters. So they had to leave and I was going to be in that shelter all alone. And I actually ended up getting a bed in the shelter on my birthday that year. So I spent my birthday in a shelter. And at the time, I was just like defeated and felt like my life couldn't get any worse and all of that. But getting into that shelter was probably one of the best things that ever happened for me. I got into their short stay area, and they have a program that's a long-term stay that you apply for. And there's only 6 rooms back in this little area where you get to stay long-term. So it was a long shot to be able to be accepted. Back there. But by the grace of God, I got accepted into their long-term program. So I had a room rent-free for as long as I needed it. And it was the perfect timing because I realized I had severe PTSD and I needed to get therapy, and I really needed a lot of help to heal. And so it was perfect to have a place I didn't have to pay for, and I didn't have to work for a little while. So I could devote all my time to going to my meetings, doing my 12-step and also getting into therapy. And then the other thing that I started doing was diving further into my New Age spiritual work. So I started seeing a lady who did healing touch and Reiki, and my best friend from high school here, she was getting into teaching meditations and doing crystal resonance therapy. Basically, all the new age things that someone can go do to heal inside, those were the things that I was doing. And what I didn't realize, of course, is that all of these new age practices actually just continue to open doors to unclean spirits. And one thing about Casey was that, and this is the other reason I tell the story about him, is that he was actually a Crowley Satanist. This was something he engaged in every time he would be in prison. He would be doing various forms of witchcraft in prison, and he had settled on Aleister Crowley's teachings, and just there was a lot of darkness around this person. And he had told me that him and some of the other men who are like career criminals who basically prefer to be in prison, they will actually actively cast spells over women outside of the prisons who they then manipulate into sending them money, sending them care packages, coming to visit, all that stuff. And when he had told me those things before everything went crazy, I hadn't really thought much about it. But then I was in this shelter all by myself, and I would have urges to go visit him in prison. He had been caught finally. I tried to file the charges because I had to wait. There was no way to prove in court that he had done what he did to me. So that kind of all went by the wayside. But once he was in prison, I started having urges and thoughts to go visit him. And it was scaring me because I knew those weren't my thoughts. I had finally accepted that he was a very dangerous person, and, I wanted nothing to do with him. So one night, I was laying in bed. And I know I was fully awake because I had got up to go to the bathroom. And I came back and laid in bed, and I experienced him astrally projecting into my room. Like I had a vision of him, and it was like he was trying to apologize to me. But I know that a lot of people might think that there isn't any substance and any reality to these things that go on in the New Age movement and or the occult or whatever you want to call it, witchcraft. But this stuff is real, and that is why the Father forbids it. He doesn't forbid things that aren't a reality. So I had this experience where he astrally projected into my room, and at that point, I felt so low and so desperate because I felt like I was inside that building with all those security doors and, 6 feet thick walls, and nobody could get in there and physically hurt me. But I had no spiritual protection from this guy it felt like he was trying to torture me in the spiritual realm. I felt like he was putting spells on me and trying to manipulate me through, he couldn't call me or anything. I wouldn't answer his phone calls. So now here he is actually projecting into my room and trying to communicate with me. And I felt very, very hopeless because I thought all the work that I was doing would protect me from him and those dark forces, but I was working with the same dark forces that he was. I just didn't know it. So fast forward, I had spent a year in this shelter. It was probably the best year of my life as far as personal growth and maturity. And while I had been in this shelter, I kept doing all of the crystal resonance therapy and the Reiki and all the meditation, and I started doing my own crystal meditations, and I started channeling spirits, and I started developing psychic medium skills and channeling spirits of the dead. I know now they were just unclean spirits, but I started to develop a lot of these dark spiritual gifts. I was psychically communicating with a guy in Texas who was doing a lot of the same kinds of techniques I was. I felt very, I felt like I was getting closer to filling that void inside of me, and still not realizing that void inside of me was where Yahweh, Father God, needed to be. And as this was all going on, I had been attending Christian churches here and there with friends. In NA, one of the things that a lot of people do is they'll go to a Christian church on a Sunday, more of like a seeker-friendly church, where there's not a whole lot of scripture preached, but there's lots of music and free coffee, and it was much more of a social thing. And I also thought, well, energy is energy, and, I'll go have Christians pray for me, and that's no different than having my friend do the Reiki on me, or I just want the good vibes from everywhere I can get them. So I had been going to a little seeker-friendly church for a while, and I would be sitting in the pews while the music would be playing, and I would have this little thought in the back of my head, you're being called to Christ. And I would laugh at that thought, because I would just think, like, why would I be called to Christ? Like, at this point in my life, I was of the complete belief that Jesus Christ was actually an ascended master. He wasn't who the Bible said he was. He actually came to teach the same things that the Buddha taught, and just everything you've heard a New Ager say about Jesus. That's what I believed about him. So when I started to hear that little voice in the back of my head, I just laughed it off. So, that was probably happening for about 6 to 8 months before I actually had my experience with him. So I get out of the shelter, and the way I got out of the shelter was probably the first miracle of God that I recognized this was God doing something for me. Because while I was in that shelter, I kept trying to save up money from the odd jobs I was doing, because I wanted to buy myself a little camper to live in. At this point, most of my life, I had rented rooms from really unstable people. I had very unstable living conditions for most of my 20s. And I always ended up living with people who could just throw me out at the drop of a hat. And I basically lived out of boxes for 8 years, because I always felt like I need to be able to just throw my stuff, into a truck and go at the drop of a hat. So what I wanted was something of my own, a little roof that was in my name, that I owned, that I could go park where I needed to park, and no one could take it away from me again. I never wanted to end up homeless ever again. And for me, my solution was a little camper. So I had kept saving up money for this, and every time I had $1,000 or $2,000 saved up, my truck would break down, and I'd have to pay to get my truck fixed. And I just felt so defeated, and I would drive around town, and I would see campers sitting in people's backyards just being untouched for, however long, and think to myself, oh, how many people just have a camper just sitting out back that they never use? Like, if only there was some kind of a service where, people donated those to the homeless. And so I started this little prayer inside of me that, oh, God, I finally had started calling him God right around this time. God, please, just find someone to donate a camper to me. That's all I need to get out of this shelter. I'm ready to leave. So it turns out there was the lady I was doing Reiki with, she had a really good friend, and she had talked about me to her friend. And this woman's name was Hope. So that was like the icing on the cake for this this is the first time I recognized that a prayer was answered. This woman, Hope, said to my friend that she had a camper sitting in her backyard for the last 20 years. They never used it. Would I like to have it? So her and her husband, Hope, drove down from Wyoming and brought me this little Terry Coach camper. And I had gotten out of the shelter, and I was staying with my mom and stepdad in their RV for a little while until this lady brought my camper. And it just, the timing, the way that the timing worked out, I managed to get the camper to my little lot in the trailer park on my birthday of that year. So an entire year later, from the first night I spent in that shelter on my birthday, I was parking my little tiny house that God had provided for me. And I laid on the floor of that little camper after everyone left, and I just cried and I cried and I cried, and I thanked God for the first time in my life. I thanked God for providing for me. But I still hadn't actually come to the realization that he was the God of the Bible and that his son is Jesus, and that, Jesus is exactly who he says he is in the Bible. So, I don't know, probably 2 months later, I was house sitting at my mom's, watching their RV while they were gone for a couple days. And I had gone over to my friend's house who does the crystal resonance therapy. And for about 2 weeks before I went over to her house, I would be praying in the mornings on my way to my little job at a coffee shop. And I would have this, I was praying to the archangels. That's something that people do in the New Age. They take these characters from the Bible like Gabriel or Michael, or they've got a whole pantheon of archangels that they pray to. So I would be praying to the archangels in the morning on my way to work. And I would have this little voice in the back of my head that would say, pray to Jesus Christ. Pray to Jesus Christ. And once again, I would laugh that off. Like, why would I pray to him? He's not an angel. He's just an ascended master. So that was going on for about 2 weeks, that I had this thought in the back of my head to pray to him, use his name and whatnot. And I just ignored it. So I went and I did this crystal resonance therapy session with my best friend. And in this session, she called upon Mother Mary. Because like I said, they'll use certain biblical characters, but they use them in the pagan way. Like for her, Mother Mary was representative of Isis. And I mean, most people probably watching this probably know that in general, most depictions of the Mother Mary, like from Catholicism, that's actually a representation of the goddess Isis. Or even further back to Semiramis. But that's a whole different video. So basically what I think what was different about this session for me was that we had used that name of that biblical character, and I had a really good session with her, and I came home, and my mom, being the recovering Catholic that she was, she had a Mary statue in her house. And so I came home and I was like saging the statue and doing my follow-up stuff from the crystal therapy. And I laid down on the bed and I started to pray like I normally did at night to the archangels. And that little voice came upon me again of pray to Jesus Christ, pray to Jesus Christ. And so that time I was open to it. And so I finally said his name. I said, and I call on Jesus Christ. And I didn't even get to finish whatever I was praying about, because as soon as I said his name, I felt his spirit. I felt his spirit drop upon me. And I knew exactly who I was in the presence of. And all of my life, I hadn't believed in him. And not only did I know that I was in the presence of Jesus, but I could feel that he was revealing the existence of the Father to me. And I knew I was in the presence of my Maker. And like all my life, that was something that I doubted even really existed. And in that moment, Jesus filled that void that was in the core of my soul for my whole life. Since I was a child, I had a void. And he filled it in that moment, and he unknotted a knot at the very core of my being that I had tried all those years to untie myself. And I felt the most incredible love and compassion flowing over me. And I had never experienced anything like that in all my years of doing New Age spiritual practices. I had lots of spiritual experiences. I had out-of-body experiences. I did astral projection. I did a lot of that stuff that confirmed for me at that time that I was on the right path. But I had never felt that love ever. And I felt that spirit of adoption. Like I felt like the father I always needed. Like I felt that I had him. So I laid there that night and had all these realizations flooding me, that he's exactly who he says he is. And it was incredible. And the next day, I was like, I don't know, high on the spirit or something. I was totally energized from what I had experienced. But keep in mind, I still was very much in the New Age mindset. I had a whole lifetime of programming that I had to come out of. And so I had accepted that Jesus Christ was real and that his Father, God, was real. But I still had all these mixed up thoughts in my head about him and what he taught. And so in my confusion, I went and I bought a Gnostic Bible. Like, I wanted to learn about him, but I did not want to do it. I didn't want to use the Bible to learn about him because I still was so programmed from having a total aversion to the scriptures that it didn't cross my mind at first to pick up that book and read about him from that book. So for probably about a month or two, I tried to balance, my New Age lifestyle with, the Spirit of Christ that was in me. But I guess I know now the word be conviction or discernment. I knew something wasn't right there. And at the little coffee shop I was working at, we had a little free library where people could leave books and take books and whatnot. And I came in and there was a King James Bible sitting on that shelf. And it wasn't a very busy coffee shop, so I had a lot of time to read. So I thought, well, I've looked at all this other stuff. I'm reading the Gnostic texts. Like, why don't I go ahead and see what this book has to say about him? And so I picked up that Bible and I started in Genesis. And immediately, and I know now it's because I had the Spirit in me when I was reading it, immediately I could tell what I was reading was the truth. And there were all these preconceived notions in me from before where I used to look at the God of the Bible as a big meanie for the things that he did in Egypt and stuff like that. But then as I started reading with the Spirit of Christ in me, I understood why what he did was just. I started to understand his long suffering, his mercy, really his heart for his creation, how much he really loves us. So once I started reading the Bible, it kind of was over from there as far as all my prior New Age beliefs. The first belief that started to fall away was probably the belief in reincarnation. I really started to think about, would a loving creator make this system of reincarnation where you're basically doomed to a countless number of lives, and until you get one of your lives right, you don't get out of that cycle, but you don't remember all the lives that you had before, but you're making up for all the karma from all those former lives. I started to really try to think about that logically, and it just wouldn't fit anymore. So that was the first thing to fall away, and after that, it just, I made it to Deuteronomy, Leviticus, these books that are, condemning witchcraft and divination and basically all the things that defined my personality since I was 12, basically. And I started to realize, wow, I was totally not in the truth. And everything I was doing to try and heal myself while I was in that shelter was only keeping me open spiritually to more and more demonic oppression. And I really just started to wake up from the years and years and years of that New Age stupor that I had been in. So I, started going to church. And that's basically, I went to church for probably about 6 months. But I was also reading my Bible at home. And I was starting to notice that there were things being taught in my church that weren't in line with what was in my Bible. So I would start to try and bring those things up at church, and they wouldn't really get talked about very much, kind of just, pushed under the rug a little bit. But I was so devoted to my Creator after everything he had done for me, after he had saved my life down when I was in Denver, after he had saved me from being homeless by getting me into that shelter, after he answered my prayer to bring me my own little home, and then after he, called me through his Son and revealed them both to me and healed in me a lifetime of pain and hurt and brokenness, I was very much devoted to trusting everything that his word said and testing everything any man told me to that standard. And so naturally that started to cause a bit of a divide with, in my heart where, I was going to church on Sunday, but I was not seeing anywhere in the New Testament where Jesus had changed the Sabbath to Sunday. And so that was kind of where it all started for me as far as coming into Torah observance. It was basically the Sabbath. I was like, okay, I need to see that if there's a verse in here that says he changed it, I will go with that. I am fine with it. If he changed it, he's the boss. But I couldn't find that verse. So, the more I studied it, the more conflicted I felt with going to church on Sunday, but feeling like I wanted to keep the Sabbath. At that point in time, I needed to look for a new job. The little coffee shop I had been working at was shutting down. And so I had a conversation with God and I said, Father, if the Sabbath is something that you want me to keep, if it really didn't change, help me get a job where I can keep your Sabbath, where I won't have to work on Saturdays. And basically immediately another miracle. Some people might have seen me talk about my job on my Facebook as really feeling like God put me there, but God found me a local business owned by a Christian couple, and they're mainstream Christian, but they totally respected the fact that I didn't want to work on Saturdays because of the Sabbath, and so they put me in their jewelry production. And again, those who might know me might know jewelry is something I've been making jewelry since I was a little kid. But especially now within the last 2 years, I've really started to do my own wire wrapping, stones and stuff. But here it was, this perfect job for me where I'm assembling earrings and necklaces, and that's one of my hobbies. It's one of my pastimes. And the place is owned by a Christian couple who respects the fact that I want to keep the Sabbath, and they respect the fact that I have holy days that I need time off for. And it's just been an incredible blessing. So that was confirmation for me that the Sabbath hadn't been changed, and that, God wanted me to keep his Sabbath and not work on his holy day. And he held up his end of the deal, I should say, because he got me into a place where I would be able to be obedient to his word to the best of my ability. And then other things started to, come up. Dietary laws, dietary instructions, I like to say. I didn't understand. At first, I thought they were just arbitrary. But again, I had a conversation with God. I'm like, hey, I want to understand. Like, I see that you said not to eat these certain animals, but I really want to understand why. And it was kind of almost immediate. I had that download of the epiphany moment of, oh, those things he made those to be on the cleanup crew. He made those animals to eat all the other icky, yucky, gross stuff, that falls to the bottom of the sea or is left behind on the land. And basically in that moment, I had any appetite that I had had for pork or shrimp or anything, pretty much was like gone. Like, I don't smell bacon and miss it or anything. I don't crave shrimp and butter. The only shellfish occasionally I think about that I liked the taste of is crab. But it's not it's not difficult to say no to crabs. Because they still are insects of the sea. They're still bottom feeders. And I see that perspective now. So basically, I started the Torah journey rather shortly after I came to Christ. And I think it's probably because I had been rebellious against my father and Christianity all that time. And so I never really spent a long enough time in any one particular church to have certain doctrines of Christianity really imprinted into my brain. So I was kind of like a blank slate when it came to reading the scriptures. Like, after everything I had been through and everything God pulled me out of, all I wanted to do was just accept whatever his word said. And anything that didn't make sense to me, I was not going to fight it. I was going to ask him for understanding and wait till he gave me the understanding. So I started keeping the Sabbath, and I started eating clean, and I found a whole community of believers on Facebook who were also waking up to the same, realizations that, oh, wow, these things weren't changed at the cross. And then most of you know, I met my husband, Sean, through Facebook, and he's just another answer to prayer, an incredible blessing in my life. And I have never been happier. I've never been more content, and I've never felt more whole and complete. And all my life, the one thing I was seeking was the one thing that I was rejecting, which is the God of the Bible. At all costs, I did not want to read that Bible, and I did not want to accept anything that it says is true. I wanted to take things from that Bible and make them fit into my own New Age thoughts, but that was the extent of it. So I just wanted to come and share with all you guys, this journey that I've taken, so that you can better understand where I'm coming from when I touch on it in our Kingdom Portions videos. I also want you to know I've completely left that life behind. I don't have anything to do with, the only thing I have to do with crystals these days is I'm wrapping them into pretty necklaces. I don't do any crystal meditations. I don't do any hypnosis. I don't do any yoga. I don't do even, just regular meditation where you empty your mind. I don't even do that stuff. And I do my best to try and help other Christians understand the dangers of those things. I thought for a little while that God brought me out so that I could bring others out of the New Age, but I've learned from my own experience that there is a spiritual blindness there, that I will only end up offending people in the New Age if I try to explain to them what's so wrong about their beliefs, because they have scales on their eyes. So what I've realized is I just need to be a beacon of that light and show that peace that surpasses understanding that I've received from Christ, and wait for people in the New Age to ask me about it, which people have. I've had friends who saw my transformation and they were so completely taken aback and blown away by the 180-degree change that I went through, that I became a witness to them, and eventually they had the same type of experience, and then would come and ask me, how does all this work? So I've learned, the Father didn't bring me out of the New Age so that I could bring others out of the New Age. He brought me out of the New Age so that I could be a beacon within our own body to the people who are Christians but are being deceived by things of the New Age. A lot of people know that this stuff is creeping into the churches, and the yoga and the contemplative prayer and just all the mixing of the holy with the profane. And a lot of Christians who lived their whole life in Christianity don't understand those things. I think I have a unique perspective because I was completely in that other world. And so I understand what goes on there. I know everything is actually really very real. And it's not something to dabble in, and it's not something to mix with the holy things of the Bible. And I know, obviously, that he brought me out of that because he had a plan for me with my husband. And so basically, I'm sorry this took so long, but I wanted you guys to just understand my story, where I came from, how I came out of that darkness and, into the light of Christ, and to just be assured that I'm not any kind of a secret New Ager or anything like that. I feel totally disgusted by any of those practices. Even the music I used to listen to. Back then, I was a huge, huge Tool fan. I have their artwork tattooed on me. I know now it's like the Eye of Horus I have on my arm. Like, oh, goodness. But it's all a journey, and it's all, I've learned from it all. And I just rejoice that Father brought me out of it. I haven't been able to listen to Tool since the night I experienced Christ. I know now I was being baptized in the Spirit. So since the night I was baptized in the Spirit, I haven't been able to listen to a single Tool song. It makes me feel like I need a shower. But I don't know. I know that people like to understand these things about the people that they listen to for teachings on YouTube. And while I don't consider myself a teacher in the sense that I would never sit here by myself and try to teach you guys anything. I really believe in being submitted to my husband and under his authority and only teaching with him as a unit. But I know that, for some people, it's helpful to know these backstories, and it's helpful to be reassured that there's no inkling of that former life in my new life now with Christ. So, yeah, I just wanted to come and share that with you guys, and I hope you can benefit from it. I also want you to be encouraged. My father's side of the family, they're all very much devout Christians, and they prayed for me for basically my whole life, guys. They prayed for me every day, especially my grandparents. Every day they prayed for me. My grandmother, my dad's mom, she was the only person in my family who was in touch with me on a regular basis when I was in that shelter. And she would call to check on me, and she would try to speak the words of God into my life, but I really wouldn't accept them. And I would keep using my own New Age language for things. And she met me where I was at, and she didn't try to correct me. She just loved me through it and prayed for me through it. And guys, when I got to call her and tell her that I had met Jesus and that I believed in him, I mean, she still cries about it to this day. When we get on the phone and we talk, she still to this day is just overcome with emotion because she cried out to God for me for a very long time. So I want you to take heart. If there are people that you love that, are deceived by this or any other religion, God hears your prayers. And he's in a battle of wills with them their whole lives, getting them. He's calling all of us, and it's up to each one individually to answer that call, like I did that night when I heard that still small voice to pray to Jesus Christ. I did have that moment where I finally gave into that and I called on him. So if you have loved ones that your heart just aches for because they're lost spiritually, don't lose faith. I'm sure my grandmother always wondered if, her prayers were being heard, and now she knows for certain that they were. So I just want to leave you with that little bit of hope, and I want to thank everyone who watched all the way to the end. It's getting to an hour here, so sorry for taking up too much of your time. But I thought maybe some of you might like to know this background about me, just so that you understand a little better where I'm coming from. So I love you all. I appreciate you. And I just want to say blessings in Christ, Yeshua, Messiah, whichever name you want to use. I know for a fact that he answers to both. So bless you all and have a great week.